is sticking to the HEMA texts, and specifically their pictures, making your fencing worse? This is a question that I think every single HEMA fighter and practitioner should be asking themselves. And in particular, I think that it's a good topic of discussion because I believe that the propensity for people to try to duplicate pictures and even words in specific texts down to the letter is causing them to ignore a lot of common sense and basic understandings of martial arts and movement in favor of what they think is being more historically accurate. But what I'm going to argue here is that, in fact, injecting what some in the community would call frog DNA into HEMA is actually not only beneficial for understanding and interpreting historical texts, but it's going to make your fencing a lot better. So sorry in advance for this one. I'm going to try to use as much footage as I can, but it's going to be a lot of me talking. So if you're not into that, well, I don't care. But start off with this argument, I want to talk specifically about pictures. And the reality being that historical texts are often extremely bare bones in terms of the information that they give. And their pictures even more so. Look at something like Lichtenauer Zettel, which has no pictures. Most of the glosses of Lichtenauer Zettel sometimes have pictures, but most of them are just lines of text. And specifically, when you're reading them, anyone who's ever read these texts is going to find out very quickly that it's extremely lacking in information on some basic fundamentals of fighting, such as footwork, distance, timing, how to actually train or practice. All of these things are missing. And this is going to come as no shock to any HEMA fighter because chances are they go to a school where an instructor sort of tells them their interpretations of these texts. You're able, of course, to go in and read the text yourself and make your own interpretations, but oftentimes I feel like that sets people back more than it moves people forward, in particular because there are often instincts and understandings of human movement and activity and fighting that exist before you read a text that are going to influence it. And in some cases, this is bad, but I think in most cases, it's actually very beneficial. So let's go to a specific example. Say you're reading the Zettel and you read the play, or I guess specifically a gloss of the Zettel in this case, and you're reading the play where Lichtenauer or one of the glosses tells you to spring forward with your dominant leg. This is one of the only times they tell you any kind of footwork, by the way, and throw a Zwerchau, which is a horizontal strike right across the middle, into your opponent when they throw an Oberhau, which is, of course, a downward angled strike at your head. Presumably, because it's 1419, everybody's right-handed or they were beaten by their nuns, and the person coming at you is coming at your left side. So you're throwing a right Zwerchau across this horizontal line straight into the path of their left side Oberhau. Great. All sounds very sound until you try it. And what you find out very quickly is that the Zwerchau is a short-range move. When your arms are up, kind of like this, they're really close to your body. It's hard to extend them forward and get the maximum amount of reach. And of course, given that we're all human beings and our arms are attached to our shoulders, getting maximum reach involves extending our arms from our shoulders, maybe even leaning forward, maybe even lunging. So we come to the spring section. You think, oh, okay, well, there's the distance, right? If I just jump far enough forward, I'll close the distance between myself and my opponent, and I'll be able to use this close range technique to close off my line horizontally from right to left, and then I guess hit them in the head. And you try it, and it still doesn't work. And it doesn't work because, as it turns out, leverage-wise, the Oberhau has a lot of power and momentum and strength in the bind that the Zwerchau doesn't have. Both of your hands are kind of dangling under the sword, and the only ability you have to put pressure to your left and right is by either rotating your body, which isn't great, and by trying to push with like the rotational force of your wrist, really weak. As opposed to the person throwing the Oberhau, they can rotate their hips, their torso, their shoulders, their arms, their head. They can even push directly into your sword with their back foot, because there's a direct line of force that can go from their foot, from the ground, to their hip, to their torso, to their shoulder, to their elbow, to their wrist, to their hand, to their sword. Everything about it is optimal. Everything about it is superior. Everything about it is faster, more efficient, in use of distance, timing, everything. So why the hell is this play in there? Well, this is where the historians are going to go, we must be doing it wrong, right? It must be that somehow the information that we're thinking is correct is wrong, because we want to believe that every interpretation, every play in these texts is good, and that if we do them exactly as was intended by the person who wrote it, it's going to work out for us. And so what do people do? They try to change the context. Oh, maybe you spring out to your right side really far. Maybe you spring out to your left side really far. Maybe the spring is just an exaggeration and he means explosively kind of jerk funny. Maybe it's about explosive rotation of the hips. Maybe he goes backwards. I don't know. No matter how many times you try to fiddle with it, though, the end result is that it just sucks. And it sucks because no matter how you slice it, no matter how you try to change up the context, there is no version of reality in a physics-based understanding, down to the fundamental science, where a Zwerchau is going to be able to protect you and land decently against another person who is throwing any kind of intelligent oppositional force with their cut. Unless they throw the most paltry nonsense, I didn't even believe I was going to hit you, throw, your ability to Zwerch through it and hit them in the head and defend yourself is basically zero. So what do we do about it? And this is where I believe everyone in HEMA is generally making a big mistake, in that they're trying to follow the picture or the letter of the text to the letter, and they're coming up short, and they're desperately trying to cram whatever kind of context or bullshit they can into the scenario to make it work based on what it says. When in my opinion, all you have to do is break it down past the letter, past the picture, and go to the tactical application. Why does the Zwerchau fail to defend you? Simple. Its structure is inferior, its travel is greater, its distance is shorter. So in what situation do all of these things suddenly help? Well, funny enough, there's another fun little line in the Zettel that says the Zwerchau thwarts what comes from above. Notice how that once again says absolutely nothing about distance or timing or footwork. But if I go into a situation, I say, where were situations in which a Zwerchau could defend me and attack at the same time? Completely ignore the play, completely ignore the picture, completely ignore what the text says, break it all the way down to its tactical core. When is it useful? Oh, easy. After you've left the bind and someone is trying to throw a follow-up Oberhau to your head. In that situation, it works wonderfully. You can even throw them a little low and tag people in the arms or the body where they weren't expecting and throw up a really nice hanging parry that protects a whole lot of your body. So why is the play so confusing? Why is the play written so poorly? Why, in the pictures that we get of this play and other KDF glosses, does it look nothing like that? Simple. Because, sorry to say it, but the people who were writing texts back in the 15th century sucked at writing. And they sucked even more at drawing. Although, in this case, a lot of times it was tertiary monks who were doing the drawing. So they were making pictures based on stuff they didn't know anything about and sometimes hadn't even seen. And the person writing it didn't really expect anybody to learn how to do this stuff by reading it. They expected you to pick up the pamphlet that said, oh, wow, this guy does all kinds of cool sword stuff. I'm going to go to his fight school in town and then I'll actually learn how to fight. And what we come down to is when you really, really want to do a good interpretation, I believe it's fundamental to start with a modern understanding of martial arts, physics, and body motion, and then apply a historical context given the sources. I'm not saying ignore the sources. I'm not even saying that these two events should be, spaced apart. You shouldn't learn how to fence and then start doing the glosses. You can do them both at the same time. All I want people to do is to recognize that your ability to interpret the context of history is virtually zero because virtually none of that context in history exists anymore. You don't know anything about how these people trained, what techniques they used, how useful they were, whether they worked, whether they were lying in their books, whether they even wrote the books. You don't know really anything. half the time you don't even know if the people who wrote them were real. So, given that, I think it's much, much smarter to trust a basic understanding of fencing, of footwork, of distance, of timing, of fighting, and then build off of it with historical context rather than the other way around. But this is where a lot of the history-focused people start grinding their teeth down into nubs. Because in a lot of ways, their interpretations and the validity that they perceive of their interpretations comes directly from their ability to inject, sometimes things that they pull completely out of their ass, inject these other historical contexts into the situation in order to make it make sense. And I've been doing this for not that long comparative to some people, 7 years, and I have heard an unending avalanche of these excuses. Whether it be the Zverkow example from earlier, like, oh, you're just not jumping hard enough. You're not jumping fast enough. You're not landing with both of your feet on the ground before you do the Zverkow. A bunch of stupid crap that doesn't make any sense that anyone who's moved their feet for more than 10 minutes would tell you isn't even physically possible, let alone, going to work. And you see this on play after play after play until you suddenly realize that, well, all right, fine, I'm just not going to do what my instructor tells me. I'm going to do what works in sparring or in a tournament. And then suddenly, again, the history people are grinding their teeth down to the gums. And they're doing it because objective reality is thwarting their historical interpretations. And the only thing they have to counter these objectively true points of basic understandings of physics and human physiology is to go, yeah, but it's not written in the text. Therefore, I can't say for sure that our modern understandings of these things aren't polluting the understanding and polluting the accuracy of our interpretations. Meanwhile, they're saying it about stuff like whether or not you can step like that, or you can lunge that deep, or whether or not you can move that fast. Things that are never, ever going to be proven contextually, historically, and things that can be proven now with people who do it. So in a lot of ways, it's these historical people who end up kind of poo-pooing the abilities of historical people by saying, they just didn't know wrestling well enough to know this was the thing. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is that if you're trying to become a better fencer, you need to consider the fact that the modern tools that we have at our disposal to learn and understand movement and fighting are not something to be discarded because they didn't exist in history. They're something to be embraced because they can help you better understand history through the things and commonalities that we share between the two time periods. Like I mentioned earlier, we only have 2 feet, we only have 2 arms, they connect in the same places. The things that are going to hold you back when doing some of these historical techniques are going to be the same things that held them back. And if you can't figure out a quick and easy way of getting around a basic problem, it's probably because you're trying to force it into a historical context where it doesn't belong. You're trying to play so close to the text or a picture or whatever it is that a master told you that you're ignoring what your eyes and your hands can feel. You're ignoring the basic realities that anyone would understand if they were actually in there doing it. And you're ignoring them on purpose because you think that somehow you're being a bad historian. So I mentioned frog DNA earlier. A lot of people might have said, what the fuck is he talking about? So anyone who's seen Jurassic Park knows that there's a funny little line in there where they said that they couldn't make the dinosaurs right because they had incomplete genomes. So he inserted frog DNA into the dinosaur genomes in order to make them dinosaurs. And this is just like a cheeky little throwaway line in a movie that basically stands there to say, hey, in 30 years, when you realize that dinosaurs don't look like that, I have a fallback. I have a fall guy. I can just blame it on the frog DNA. That's why they look like lizards. And when they should have looked like chickens, I guess. So frog DNA in HEMA is exactly what I've been talking about this whole time. Injecting modern understandings, modern things, frog DNA into the genome of historical sources in order to make them work, in order to make them make sense, in order to come out with a live dinosaur. If you don't come out with a live dinosaur at the end, you got nothing. So if you don't put any frog DNA in there, you're stuck trying to spring as hard as you can to your right and Zverkowing into somebody's Oberhow and just eating shit every single time. Or you inject that frog DNA, and more specifically, you just put a little bit of spice in there. You just look at what frog DNA you're putting into this genome and you think, is it of quality? Is it based on real modern science? Because I can totally understand someone saying, oh man, I can't do this historical technique. It's too unsafe. Nowadays, we care about safety, but back then they didn't care about safety. Yeah, they didn't really care about safety, but you don't really know how unsafe something is until you do it. So until you inject your frog DNA of modernity in there, you just flat out don't have anything to compare it to. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a basic framework on how to learn how to fence. And ironically, it is something that I've heard being brought up by other people, other old school HEMA teachers, who were very, very strict with their interpretations of the sources, like Jake Norwood, who in a video from a couple of years back brought out that in the beginning he had taught all of his students the Zettel and the glosses, and he found that people were struggling to get any of the master strikes to work, which makes sense. They're supposed to be master strikes, right? They're not masters, which led him to believe that, oh, well, maybe I should just teach common fencing instead. I should teach people the very, very basic elements of fighting with a weapon, and then later give them the master strikes to chew on so that they know how to beat the other people who just knew how to do the basics. If you look at it that way, virtually every text follows in that line. If you were, say, a person from the year 1415 and you wanted to get people to come to your school, you're not going to put the basics in your book, and you're probably not very smart as far as an actual teacher. You don't have modern understandings of group dynamics and leadership theory. So you're kind of just freeballing it. And you put your little manuscript together and you put all your favorite moves in there, and you put in the moves that make you famous. You put in your master strikes. You put in your masterful work. And you put in the best, craziest, sometimes the most effective, and sometimes the flashiest moves that you can in there to get people to come to your school, where inevitably they learn the basics. They learn to move their feet. They learn to move their hands. They learn to measure distance and timing and footwork. And they learn all of those things, and then they'd be taught the masterful moves. Then they'd be able to pull off the masterful moves. Then they'd be an actual fencer who learned from another fencer, rather than someone who just picked up some sticks and played around in their backyard. If we want to be more than common fencers, we need the texts. But if we want to be more than common fencers, we need to be common fencers first. We need to be able to use our modern understandings of teaching and mobility and physical human bodies in order to get to stage 1, and then we can move to stage 2. So that's it. If you think I'm full of shit, feel free to yell at me in the comments. If not, send me big essays like the ones I got last time. I love it when comments are in paragraphs. That's just, I definitely read them and I don't ignore them. But if you do like it, feel free to like and subscribe, and you'll hear more hot takes about how to be a shit fencer next week.